The fluorescent lights of the airport parking lot cast harsh shadows across the rows of cars as I walked toward the long-term section. I'd just returned from a consulting trip to Denver, my engineering mind still processing the technical specifications I'd reviewed for an aerospace firm. At 62, these trips were becoming less frequent, but my reputation in the industry still opened doors. What I didn't expect to find was my son's Honda Civic tucked between two SUVs, windows fogged with condensation. I froze in my tracks when I recognized the license plate. Through the rear window, I could make out small forms huddled under blankets. My heart hammered against my ribs as I approached the driver's side and gently tapped on the glass. Ethan's face appeared, bleary and confused. Behind him, I could see my 7-year-old twin grandsons, Jackson and Tyler, curled up in the back seat with their school backpacks serving as pillows. The sight hit me like a physical blow. "Dad?" Ethan's voice was muffled through the window. He fumbled with the door handle, stepping out into the cold October air. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "Ethan, what the hell is going on? Why are you and the boys sleeping in your car?" My son, who had once stood proudly in front of investors pitching his innovative logistics software, now looked like a broken man. He glanced back at the car where Jackson and Tyler were stirring awake, then met my eyes with a mixture of shame and desperation. "We got evicted 3 days ago," he whispered. "Lauren changed the locks. She said the house belongs to her family now, and we have no legal right to be there." The words didn't make sense. "What do you mean, her family? You bought that house together. Your name is on the deed." Ethan's laugh was bitter. "Apparently not anymore. Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to stay calm." He took a shaky breath. "Where do you think the $300,000 you invested in my startup went?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. I'd invested that money 18 months ago when Ethan's company, LogiFlow Solutions, was gaining traction with several major retailers. The software streamlined supply chain management in ways that could save companies millions. Oh, it was brilliant, innovative, and entirely my son's creation. "It went into your company, into LogiFlow. We have the contracts, Dad," Ethan's voice cracked. "Lauren's family took everything. The company, the house, even my access to our joint bank accounts. They've rewritten the entire history of LogiFlow. According to the new corporate documents, Harriet Preston, Lauren's mother, is listed as the founding CEO. Her husband Peter is the CFO. Lauren is the head of operations. I'm not mentioned anywhere." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "That's impossible. You founded that company. I have the original business plan you wrote. I have the patent applications with your name on them." "They have lawyers, Dad. Good ones. They've been planning this for months, maybe longer." Ethan's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "And Mom? Mom sided with them. She said I was irresponsible with money and that Lauren's family knows better how to run a business." The betrayal cut deep. Alicia, my wife of 35 years, had always harbored resentment about what she called my coddling of Ethan. She'd grown closer to Lauren's family over the past year, often praising Harriet Preston's business acumen and suggesting that Ethan needed stronger guidance. "Grandpa Frank?" Tyler's small voice came from the car window. "Are we going home now?" I looked at my grandson's hopeful face and felt something harden inside my chest. These children, innocent, confused, displaced from their beds and their toys, had become collateral damage in what was clearly a calculated theft. "Yes, buddy," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. "We're going to fix this." But first, I needed to understand exactly what had been done and how. I needed facts, documentation, and a clear picture of the battlefield. Because that's what this was, a war. And people like Harriet Preston had made a crucial mistake. They'd assumed that a quiet, aging engineer like me would roll over and accept defeat. They had no idea who they were dealing with. 20 minutes later, we sat in Mel's Diner on Route 9, the boys sharing a stack of pancakes while Ethan nursed his third cup of coffee. I'd gotten them a motel room for the night, but the conversation we needed to have couldn't wait. "Start from the beginning," I said. "When did this start?" Ethan stared into his coffee. Looking back, probably 6 months after Lauren and I got married. Her mother started showing up at the office, offering advice about business operations. She said her real estate investment background gave her insights into scaling companies. "And you let her?" Lauren was pregnant with the twins. Harriet seemed genuinely helpful, and she had connections. She introduced us to investors, helped us move into a bigger office space. Ethan's jaw tightened. What I didn't realize was that every introduction came with strings attached. Every piece of advice was designed to make me more dependent on her network. I pulled out a small notebook, an old habit from my engineering days. What about the legal documents? The ownership structure? That's where it gets complicated. Ethan glanced at the boys who were absorbed in their food. About a year ago, Harriet convinced me that the company needed to restructure for tax purposes. She brought in her lawyer, some high-powered firm in the city, and they presented me with what they called optimization paperwork. New corporate structure, updated shareholder agreements, revised operating procedures. Did you read them? I tried. But Dad, these weren't the simple contracts we started with. They were hundreds of pages of legal language that might as well have been written in a foreign language. Lauren kept saying her family was looking out for our interests, that they wanted to protect the boy's future. His voice grew bitter. Harriet even said the restructuring would make it easier for you to recover your investment if anything happened to me. That detail caught my attention. She specifically mentioned my investment multiple times. She said the new structure would give you better protection as a founding investor. Ethan met my eyes. Dad, I think they planned this from the beginning. I think they targeted Lauren to get to the company, and they targeted the company to get to your money. The possibility sent a chill through me. Lauren had met Ethan at a tech networking event, an event I later learned was partially funded by Harriet Preston's real estate investment group. The courtship had been swift, the marriage even swifter, and throughout their relationship, Lauren had shown an unusual interest in my background, my connections in the aerospace industry, and my financial situation. What about Doug Harper? I asked. Doug had been Ethan's original business partner, a sharp programmer who'd helped develop LogiFlow's core algorithms. Forced out 8 months ago, Harriet's people found some discrepancies in his expense reports, minor stuff like claiming lunch meetings that couldn't be verified. They made it into a big scandal about financial responsibility and convinced the board to vote him out. Ethan's hands clenched around his coffee cup. Doug tried to warn me. He said Harriet was positioning her people to take control. I didn't listen. Where is Doug now? Last I heard, he was working freelance, barely making rent. The Prestons made sure he couldn't get hired anywhere in the local tech scene. They spread word that he was unreliable with money. I made a note. Doug Harper might be a valuable ally, someone with inside knowledge and a personal grudge against the Preston family. What about the house? Ethan's face darkened. 2 weeks ago, Lauren told me we needed to refinance to take advantage of better interest rates. Again, her father handled the paperwork. I signed what I thought were refinancing documents. He paused. Turns out I was signing the deed over to a trust controlled by the Preston family. The mortgage is now in their name, and legally I have no claim to the property. That's fraud. Prove it. They have documents with my signature. They have witnesses. Lauren, her parents, their lawyer. And they have a story. That I was financially irresponsible and asked them to take over the mortgage to prevent foreclosure. I studied my son's defeated posture and felt a familiar analytical calm settle over me. This was a problem, and problems had solutions. The Preston family had been methodical and clever, but they'd also been greedy. Greed led to mistakes, and mistakes left trails. Ethan, I need you to think carefully. Do you have access to any of the original company files? Email accounts, backup drives, anything from before the restructuring? They changed all the passwords, revoked my access to everything. He paused. But I might have some old files on my personal laptop. And Doug was always paranoid about data security. He might have backups. Good. What about the original investment documents, the contracts between me and LogiFlow? I have copies at home, but Ethan stopped. I can't get into the house. I have copies too, and I have something else. I leaned forward. I have 30 years of experience in an industry where contracts mean everything and where one misplaced decimal point can cost millions. I know how to read legal documents, and I know how to find the loopholes. For the first time since I'd found him in that parking lot, Ethan's expression showed a flicker of hope. Dad, they have lawyers. They have money. They have connections. Son, I've been underestimated my entire career. People see a quiet engineer and assume I'm naive about business and politics. I closed my notebook and signaled for the check. But you know what I learned in 30 years of aerospace contracts? The most dangerous opponent is the one who does their homework and keeps their mouth shut. As we left the diner, I made a mental list of my next steps. First, I needed to examine every document related to my investment and Ethan's company. Second, I needed to contact Doug Harper and assess what resources he might have. Third, I needed to understand the full scope of what the Preston family had taken and how they'd done it. But most importantly, I needed to do all of this without alerting them to my intentions. They'd shown their hand by throwing Ethan and the boys out of their home. They thought they'd won, that their victory was complete, that overconfidence would be their downfall. My home office had always been my sanctuary. a place where I could spread out technical drawings, review contract specifications, and think through complex problems without interruption. Now it had become a war room. I'd spent the morning driving past what used to be Ethan's house, watching as Harriet Preston's silver Mercedes pulled into the driveway. Through the front windows, I could see her directing what appeared to be interior decorators. She was already making the place her own, erasing any trace of my son's presence. The sight had filled me with cold fury, but I'd kept driving. Emotional reactions led to mistakes, and I couldn't afford mistakes. Now, back at my desk, I pulled out the filing cabinet where I kept all my investment records. The original LogiFlow documents were exactly where I'd left them, in a folder labeled Ethan's Company. As I spread them across my desk, I felt the familiar satisfaction of organized data. The initial investment agreement was straightforward: $300,000 in exchange for a 25% ownership stake in LogiFlow Solutions. Ethan retained 51% as founder and CEO, with 24% reserved for future investors and employee stock options. My signature was clear and dated 18 months ago. Ethan's signature was equally clear, but there was something else, an addendum page that I didn't remember signing. The language was dense and filled with legal jargon, but the essence was clear. Under certain circumstances, my investment could be transferred to a qualified management entity if the original founder was deemed unable to fulfill fiduciary responsibilities. I stared at that page for a long time. My signature was there, but something about it looked wrong. The ink was slightly different. The pressure of the pen strokes didn't match my usual style. I pulled out a magnifying glass and examined it more closely. It was a good forgery, but it was still a forgery. I photographed the page with my phone, then called my daughter Vivian. At 38, she was a successful architect with a sharp eye for detail and a healthy skepticism about people's motives. She'd never warmed to Lauren, often commenting that her sister-in-law seemed more interested in family finances than family relationships. "Dad, how was your Denver trip?" "Complicated. Vivian, I need your help with something, and I need you to keep this between us for now." I explained the situation, watching her expression grow darker through our video call. "Those individuals," she said when I finished. "Dad, this is theft. Straightforward and undeniable. I know, but proving it is going to take time and strategy. Can you meet me this afternoon? I want you to look at some documents." "I'll be there in an hour." While I waited for Vivian, I decided to visit LogiFlow's office. The company had moved into a sleek building in the tech district downtown, a far cry from the shared workspace where Ethan had started. I told myself I was just conducting reconnaissance, but part of me needed to see what they'd done to my son's creation. The lobby was impressive, all glass and steel with LogiFlow's logo prominently displayed. But when I looked closer at the company directory, my jaw tightened. The executive listing showed Harriet Preston as founder and CEO, Peter Preston as CFO, and Lauren Carter as Chief Operating Officer. Ethan's name appeared nowhere. "Can I help you?" The receptionist was young, probably fresh out of college. "I'm Franklin Carter. I have a meeting with Harriet Preston." It was a lie, but I wanted to see how they'd react to my name. The receptionist's expression shifted slightly. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter, but Ms. Preston is in meetings all afternoon. Would you like me to schedule something for later this week?" "Ms. Preston?" I kept my voice neutral. "I thought she was Mrs. Preston." "Oh, she uses her maiden name for business. Preston Investments, you know. She's very successful in real estate." I thanked the receptionist and left, but not before noting the security cameras and the badge access system. This wasn't just a hostile takeover, it was a complete rebranding of Ethan's life's work. Back at home, Vivian was waiting in my driveway, her expression grim. We spread all the documents across my dining room table, and she examined them with the methodical precision she'd inherited from me. "Dad, look at this." She pointed to the addendum page. "See how the paper is slightly different? It's the same weight and color, but the texture is wrong. This was printed on a different machine." "You think it was added later?" "I think it was created later. Look at the date format, too. Your original documents use MMDDYY, but this addendum uses MMDDYIBY. Small difference, but consistent with different software or different document templates." I felt a surge of pride in my daughter's attention to detail. "What else do you see?" "The signature is good, but not perfect. See this loop in the F? You always make that loop slightly larger when you're signing important documents. It's a subconscious thing you do when you're being careful. This signature is too uniform, like someone practiced it, but didn't understand the pressure variations." We spent 2 hours going through every document, making notes and taking photographs. By the time we finished, we had a clear picture of how the fraud had been executed. The Preston family had created false documents, forged signatures, and use their legal connections to make the theft appear legitimate. Dad, we need to call the police. Not yet. We need more evidence, and we need to understand the full scope of what they've taken. If we move too early, they'll destroy evidence and claim we're just disgruntled family members. So, what's the plan? I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a contact I hadn't called in months. First, we talked to someone who understands both the technical and legal sides of the situation. Dennis White had been my attorney for 15 years, handling everything from contract reviews to patent applications. At 63, he was sharp, experienced, and had a particular talent for finding weaknesses in seemingly airtight legal documents. Frank, good to hear from you. How's retirement treating you? It's complicated, Dennis. I need your help with something sensitive. Can we meet tomorrow? Of course. My office or yours? Yours. And Dennis? This involves fraud, forgery, and theft. Significant amounts of money and a family business. There was a pause. I'll clear my afternoon schedule. After I hung up, Vivian looked at me with a mixture of admiration and concern. Dad, you're planning something big, aren't you? I'm planning to get my son's life back, and I'm planning to make sure the people who stole from him face real consequences. What about Mom? She's going to be caught in the middle of this. That was the question I'd been avoiding. Alicia's betrayal cut deeper than the financial theft. She'd chosen Lauren's family over her own son, and I wasn't sure our marriage would survive this conflict. Your mother made her choice. I'm making mine. That evening, I drove to the motel where Ethan and the boys were staying. The sight of my grandsons doing homework on a small table while their father stared blankly at the wall filled me with renewed determination. Dad, any luck with the research? More than luck. We found evidence of forgery and document fraud. Tomorrow I'm meeting with Dennis White to discuss legal options. Ethan's eyes widened. You really think we can fight this? Son, I spent 3 decades in an industry where billion-dollar projects succeed or fail based on contract language and technical specifications. The Preston family is clever, but they made mistakes, and mistakes leave evidence. What can I do to help? I need you to contact Doug Harper. Find out if he still has access to any original LogiFlow files or if he kept backups of the company's development work. And I need you to think back to every document you signed, every meeting you attended, every conversation you had with Lauren's family about the business. Dad, there were so many documents. Harriet always said they were routine business matters, tax optimizations, legal updates. Write down everything you remember. Dates, witnesses, what was said. We're going to build a timeline of their fraud, and we're going to use it to destroy them. As I drove home, I felt the familiar satisfaction of a complex problem beginning to yield to systematic analysis. The Preston family had been methodical in their theft, but they'd also been overconfident. They'd assumed that their victims, a struggling entrepreneur and his aging father, wouldn't have the resources or knowledge to fight back. They were about to learn how wrong they were. But first, I needed to gather more intelligence. I needed to understand their financial situation, their legal vulnerabilities, and their plans for LogiFlow. Most importantly, I needed to do all of this without alerting them to my investigation. In my garage, I pulled out boxes of old business records looking for anything that might be relevant. In one box, I found correspondence from other investors, technical specifications for early LogiFlow prototypes, and email printouts from the company's first year of operation. One email caught my attention. It was from Doug Harper to Ethan, dated 6 months before Doug was forced out. The subject line read, "Concerns about new management structure." In the email, Doug outlined his worries about Harriet Preston's increasing involvement in company operations. He noted that she'd been asking detailed questions about the software's source code, the customer database, and the intellectual property portfolio. He'd even suggested that they consult with an independent lawyer before signing any more documents. Ethan had responded dismissively, saying that Lauren's family was just trying to help and that Doug was being paranoid. Now, that paranoia looked like prescience. I photographed the email exchange and added it to my growing evidence file. Tomorrow's meeting with Dennis White would determine whether we had enough to build a legal case. But regardless of the legal options, I was beginning to formulate a more comprehensive plan. The Preston family had stolen my son's company by manipulating legal documents and exploiting family relationships. They'd celebrated their victory by throwing him and his children out of their home. They thought they were untouchable because they had money, lawyers, and social connections. But they'd forgotten something crucial. They'd built their empire on a foundation of lies and stolen assets. And foundations built on lies had a tendency to crumble when subjected to the right kind of pressure. I just needed to find the right pressure points. Dennis White's law office occupied the top floor of a converted Victorian mansion downtown, its windows offering a panoramic view of the city's business district. I'd always appreciated Dennis's approach to legal work, methodical, thorough, and utterly lacking in drama. Today, I needed that steady competence more than ever. "Frank, you look like hell," Dennis said as his secretary showed me into his office, "and you sounded serious on the phone. What's going on?" I spent 40 minutes laying out the entire situation, spreading documents across his conference table while he took notes on a legal pad. Dennis asked pointed questions about dates, witnesses, and the sequence of events. When I finished, he sat back in his chair and studied the evidence. "This is sophisticated," he said finally. "Whoever planned this understood both corporate law and family dynamics. They used your son's trust in his wife and your trust in your son to manipulate the entire situation. Can we prove fraud? Possibly. The forged signature on the addendum is our strongest evidence, but we'll need a handwriting expert to make it stick in court. The bigger problem is that they've created a paper trail that supports their version of events." Dennis pulled out one of the corporate restructuring documents. "Look at this. They have board meeting minutes showing unanimous votes for management changes. They have financial statements showing improved performance under new leadership. They even have signed statements from employees praising the new management structure. All fabricated. Not necessarily. They may have held real board meetings and gotten real votes, but they controlled who was on the board and what information those board members received. It's manipulation, but it might not be legally actionable." I felt a familiar frustration, the same feeling I'd had when dealing with government bureaucracy in my aerospace work. Legal technicalities protecting people who were clearly in the wrong. What about the house? Ethan's signature on the deed transfer. That's more promising. If your son can prove he didn't understand what he was signing, or if we can show he was deceived about the nature of the documents, we might have grounds for a fraud claim. Dennis made another note. "But we'd need witnesses or documentation of the deception." "What about my investment? $300,000 should leave a clear trail." "It does, and that's actually our best angle. Your original investment agreement is clear and unambiguous. The addendum that allegedly allows for transfer to the Preston family is obviously forged. We can trace where your money went and demand its return." Dennis pulled out a calculator and started working through numbers. "Here's what I think happened. They used your investment to capitalize the company restructuring, then used the restructured company as collateral for additional loans and investments. Your $300,000 has probably been leveraged into several $1 million of assets. So they're not just thieves, they're successful thieves. For now. But leverage works both ways. If we can prove the original restructuring was fraudulent, then all the subsequent transactions become questionable. Banks don't like questionable collateral." I leaned forward. "What do you need from me?" "First, we need to document everything. I want a complete timeline of every interaction between your family and the Prestons. Second, we need to find Doug Harper and get his testimony about what he witnessed. Third, we need to examine LogiFlow's current financial situation and corporate structure." "How do we do that last part?" Dennis smiled, the first time I'd seen him look optimistic since I'd arrived. "Corporate records are public information. We can pull their filings, see who's on the board, understand their debt structure. If they've been using your son's company as a personal piggy bank, there will be evidence. And then? Then we have options. We can file criminal fraud charges, civil theft claims, and corporate governance challenges. We can freeze assets, demand audits, and force them to prove their ownership claims in court." Dennis's expression grew serious. "But Frank, this is going to be expensive and time-consuming, and it's going to get ugly. Family disputes always do." "Dennis, they threw my grandsons out of their beds and made them sleep in a car. It's already ugly." After leaving Dennis's office, I drove to the county records building. If the Preston family had been manipulating property deeds and corporate documents, there would be a paper trail in the public records. The clerk at the records office was helpful, but overwhelmed. It took 2 hours to pull all the relevant documents, but what I found was illuminating. The deed transfer for Ethan's house had been filed just 3 weeks ago, despite Lauren's claim that it was part of a refinancing from months earlier. More interesting, the property was now owned by something called Preston Family Holdings, which appeared to be a shell company created specifically for this transaction. I also pulled LogiFlow's corporate filings. The company had been restructured 4 times in the past year, with ownership and management changing each time. The pattern was clear: gradual dilution of Ethan's control, systematic transfer of assets to Preston-controlled entities, and careful documentation of each step. But there was something else. LogiFlow's most recent filing showed significant debt, over $2 million in loans and credit facilities. The company I'd invested in as a profitable startup was now heavily leveraged, with most of its assets pledged as collateral. I photographed all the relevant documents and drove home to process what I'd learned. The Preston family hadn't just stolen Ethan's company. They'd turned it into a debt-laden vehicle for their other business ventures. If those ventures failed, LogiFlow would be left holding worthless paper. That evening, I called Ethan with an update and a request. I need you to find Doug Harper, tonight. We need to know what he remembers and what evidence he might have. Dad, I'm not even sure how to reach him. After he was forced out, he pretty much disappeared from the local tech scene. Try LinkedIn, try mutual friends, try his old college roommates. We need him. Okay, I'll make some calls. Dad, how bad is this? Really? I considered how much to tell him. The full scope of the fraud was staggering, but I didn't want to overwhelm him when he was already at his lowest point. It's bad, son, but it's also fixable. The Preston family got greedy, and greed leads to mistakes. We're going to use those mistakes against them. What about Mom? Have you talked to her? That was the conversation I'd been dreading. Alicia had called twice since my Denver trip, both times to ask about my travel schedule and whether I'd seen Ethan. I'd kept my answers vague, but I couldn't avoid her much longer. Not yet, but that conversation is coming. Dad, she really believes Lauren's family is trying to help. Harriet convinced her that I was mismanaging the company and that intervention was necessary to protect the boy's future. Your mother has always been susceptible to people who present themselves as authorities. Harriet Preston is very good at playing that role. But what happens when you expose what they've done? Mom's going to be humiliated. She vouched for them, supported them, even sided with them against her own son. I stared out my office window at the house where I'd raised Ethan and Vivian, where I'd built a life with Alicia over 3.5 decades. The thought of that life collapsing was painful, but not as painful as watching my grandson sleep in a car. Son, your mother made her choice. I'm making mine. 2 hours later, Ethan called back with good news. He'd tracked down Doug Harper through a mutual friend from their college days. Doug was living in a small apartment across town, working freelance programming jobs and struggling to rebuild his reputation after the Preston's character assassination. He wants to meet, Ethan said. Tonight, if possible. He says he has information we need to hear. Doug Harper looked like he'd aged 5 years in the 8 months since I'd last seen him. Always thin, he was now gaunt, with the hollow-eyed look of someone under chronic stress. But when he saw Ethan and me approaching his apartment building, his expression shifted from wariness to something like relief. Ethan, Mr. Carter, I wondered when you'd come looking for me. His apartment was sparse, a futon, a desk with multiple monitors, and boxes of computer equipment stacked against the walls. But it was clean and organized, the workspace of someone who took their craft seriously despite their circumstances. Doug, I owe you an apology, Ethan began. You tried to warn me and I didn't listen. You were in love, man, and Lauren's family is very good at what they do. They've done this before. That caught my attention. Done what before? Doug pulled out a laptop and opened a folder labeled Preston Research. After they forced me out, I got curious. I started looking into Harriet Preston's business history, her family's financial dealings, their pattern of investments. He showed us a timeline he'd created, documenting the Preston family's involvement with various businesses over the past decade. The pattern was consistent. They would identify successful small companies with vulnerable ownership structures, cultivate relationships with key family members, gradually assume control through legal maneuvering, and finally absorb the companies into their investment portfolio. LogiFlow is the 5th company they've done this to, Doug said. The others were a marketing firm, a small manufacturing company, a restaurant chain, and a software development shop. What happened to the original owners? Forced out, bought out for pennies on the dollar, or simply erased from the corporate history. In every case, the Preston family ended up with valuable assets for minimal investment. I studied the timeline, feeling pieces of the puzzle click into place. This isn't opportunistic theft, it's a business model. Exactly, and they're very good at it. They target companies with strong technical assets, but weak legal protections. They exploit family relationships and trust to gain access, and they use their legal and financial resources to make the theft appear legitimate. Ethan looked sick. So Lauren never loved me? The whole relationship was just a setup? Doug's expression softened. I don't know about that, man. But I do know that her family identified LogiFlow as a target long before she met you. The networking event where you two met, it was partially funded by Preston Investments. Do you have evidence of this pattern? I asked. Some. Public records, news articles about the other companies, financial filings. But the families involved were either bought off or intimidated into silence. No one's ever challenged the Preston family in court. What about LogiFlow specifically? Do you have any evidence of the fraud? Doug smiled for the first time since we'd arrived. "Mr. Carter, I'm a programmer. I believe in backups." He opened another folder on his laptop. "I have complete copies of LogiFlow's original source code, business plans, customer databases, and financial records. Everything from before the Preston family got involved." "How?" "I set up an automated backup system that copied everything to an encrypted server. When they forced me out, they revoked my access to the company systems, but they never found the backup server. I've been maintaining it ever since, just in case." I felt a surge of excitement. "Can you prove that the current LogiFlow management has been altering or destroying original company records?" "Better than that. I can prove they have been selling customer data to competitors, inflating revenue numbers for investor presentations, and using company funds for personal expenses. Everything Harriet Preston accused me of doing, she's actually been doing herself." Ethan leaned forward. "Doug, why didn't you come forward with this earlier?" "Who was I going to tell? The board that voted me out? The investors who believed the Preston family's story about my financial improprieties? The local business community that blacklisted me based on their word?" Doug's voice grew bitter. "I'm a programmer with no money and no connections. They're a prominent family with lawyers and political influence." "But now you have allies," I said, "and we have a plan." I spent the next hour outlining what Dennis White and I had discussed, the evidence we'd gathered, and the legal strategy we were developing. Doug listened intently, occasionally asking technical questions about data recovery and documentation standards. "Mr. Carter, I want to help, but I need to know this is real. I can't afford to have the Preston family come after me again if this falls apart." "Doug, I've spent 30 years in an industry where failure has catastrophic consequences, and success means billion-dollar projects function flawlessly. I don't start conflicts I can't see through to the end." I met his eyes. "The Preston family made this personal when they hurt my grandsons. I'm going to destroy them, legally and financially. The only question is whether you want to help or watch from the sidelines." Doug was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. "What do you need me to do?" "First, document everything you have, every backup file, every piece of evidence, every detail about the original company structure. Second, prepare a technical report showing how the current management has altered or destroyed original company data. Third, be ready to testify about what you witnessed during the takeover." "And in return?" "In return, when we reclaim LogiFlow, you get your job back, with a significant equity stake and a formal apology." I paused. "And you get to watch Harriet Preston explain to a federal judge why she's been committing wire fraud and corporate theft." As we left Doug's apartment, Ethan was quiet, processing everything we'd learned. Finally, he spoke. "Dad, this is bigger than I thought. They're not just thieves, they're professional predators." "Which means they have more to lose than we do. Professional predators rely on their reputation and their network. When we expose what they've done, we don't just recover your company, we destroy their ability to do this to anyone else." "What's our next step?" "Tomorrow, we take all this evidence to Dennis White and start building the legal case, but tonight, we start planning something else." "What?" I thought about the timeline Doug had shown us, the pattern of companies destroyed and families ruined. I thought about my grandson sleeping in a car while Harriet Preston redecorated their home. I thought about the investor networking event invitation I'd found in my mail, the event where the Preston family would be celebrating their latest conquest. We're going to give them a chance to celebrate their victory, and then we're going to take everything away from them in front of everyone they want to impress. Dennis White's conference room had been transformed into a command center. Documents covered every surface, whiteboards displayed timelines and corporate structures, and Doug Harper's laptop displayed screens of code and financial data. After 3 days of intensive preparation, we finally had a complete picture of the Preston family's operation. "This is the most sophisticated theft I've ever seen," Dennis said, reviewing Doug's technical analysis. "They didn't just steal a company, they created an entire false history to justify the theft." Doug pulled up a side-by-side comparison on his laptop. "Look at this. On the left is LogiFlow's original business plan, written by Ethan 18 months ago. On the right is the version currently on file with the state, supposedly written by Harriet Preston 2 years ago. The documents were nearly identical, except for the names and dates. Every innovative idea, every technical specification, every market analysis that Ethan had developed had been copied and attributed to Harriet Preston." "They didn't just steal the company," I said. "They stole my son's intellectual property and claimed it as their own original work." "It gets worse," Doug continued. "I've been monitoring their investor presentations. They're using Ethan's original prototypes and claiming they developed the technology in-house. They're showing revenue projections based on customer relationships that Ethan built, but they're telling investors that those relationships came from their own business development efforts. Dennis made notes on his legal pad. This gives us multiple angles of attack: intellectual property theft, securities fraud, corporate identity theft. We can file both criminal and civil complaints. How long will that take? I asked. 6 months minimum, probably longer. These cases are complex, and the Preston family will fight every step of the way. I stood and walked to the window, looking down at the busy street below. 6 months of legal battles while my grandsons lived in motel rooms and my son's reputation remained destroyed. 6 months of the Preston family profiting from their theft while we waited for justice. Dennis, what if we don't wait for the courts? What do you mean? I turned back to the room. What if we use their own methods against them? They gained control through legal manipulation and public relations. What if we take control the same way? Dennis looked skeptical. Frank, I can't advise you to do anything illegal. I'm not talking about anything illegal. I'm talking about using the corporate governance rules they've been exploiting. I moved to the whiteboard and started sketching out a corporate structure. Doug, you said they've been diluting ownership through multiple restructurings. How many shares are currently outstanding? Doug pulled up LogiFlow's current corporate filings. Looks like 2 million shares. Harriet Preston controls about 40% through various entities. Peter Preston has 15%, Lauren has 10%. The rest is held by small investors and an employee stock option pool. What about my original 25% stake? According to their filings, your shares were converted to preferred stock with limited voting rights during the last restructuring. I smiled. Doug, pull up the original investment agreement I signed, the real one, not the forged version. Doug found the document in his backup files and displayed it on the screen. I pointed to a clause near the bottom of the second page. Look at Section 12. Investor retains right of first refusal on any additional equity offerings and maintains pro rata ownership percentage through anti-dilution provisions. Dennis leaned forward to read the clause more carefully. Frank, if this is valid, then all the subsequent dilutions of your ownership were illegal. You should still own 25% of the company. More than that, I said. If the dilutions were illegal, then the shares issued to the Preston family are invalid, which means their control of the company is invalid. But they have board control, Doug pointed out. Even if your ownership percentage is higher than they claim, they still control the voting. Not necessarily, I turned to Dennis. What happens if we can prove that the current board was elected through fraudulent means? The board elections would be invalidated. The company would revert to its previous governance structure until new elections could be held. And who controlled the previous governance structure? Dennis checked the original corporate documents. Ethan, as majority shareholder and founder. I felt the pieces clicking into place. So, if we can prove fraud in the board elections and invalidate the share dilutions, Ethan regains control of his company immediately. In theory, yes, but proving fraud in a corporate governance context is extremely difficult. We'd need evidence of deliberate deception, falsified documents, or violation of shareholder rights. Doug had been quiet during this exchange, but now he looked up from his laptop with an expression I recognized. The look of a programmer who'd just solved a complex problem. Mr. Carter, what if we don't have to prove fraud in court? What if we can prove it to the shareholders directly? What do you mean? The Preston family has been courting new investors, right? They're planning a big presentation at that networking event next week. What if we showed up with evidence of their fraud and presented it to the investors directly? Dennis shook his head. Doug, that could be considered interference with business relationships. It might even be defamation if we can't prove our claims. But what if we can prove our claims? I asked. What if we have documentation, witnesses, and technical evidence? What if we present the facts and let the investors draw their own conclusions? I walked back to the whiteboard and started sketching out a timeline. The networking event is in 5 days. The Preston family will be presenting LogiFlow as their success story to potential investors. What if we use that event to present the real story? Dad, they'll have security. They'll have lawyers. They'll never let us into the event, much less give us a chance to speak. I turned to Ethan, who had been quietly listening to our discussion. Son, whose name is on the original investor list for that event? Ethan thought for a moment. Mine, originally, but Lauren's family took over the planning months ago. But you were one of the founding sponsors. Your name is probably still on the registration list. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to the event invitation I'd received. And look at this. The invitation is addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Franklin Carter, founding investors. Doug grinned. so you have legitimate access to the event. Better than that. As founding investors, we probably have a right to address the attendees about our investment experience. Dennis was still skeptical. Frank, even if you can get into the event, confronting them publicly is risky. If your evidence isn't airtight, you could face lawsuits for defamation, interference, and a dozen other claims. Then we make sure our evidence is airtight. I turned to Doug. How long would it take you to prepare a comprehensive technical presentation showing the theft of intellectual property and the falsification of company records? If I work around the clock, 3 days, maybe 4. Dennis, how long to prepare legal documentation showing the fraudulent share dilutions and board elections? About the same, assuming we can get expert verification of the forged signatures. I looked around the room at my unlikely team, a bitter attorney, a displaced programmer, and my defeated son. Then we have our timeline. Doug prepares the technical evidence. Dennis prepares the legal documentation. I coordinate the presentation and handle logistics. What about me? Ethan asked. You practice, because when we walk into that ballroom, you're going to stand up in front of everyone who matters in the local tech community and tell them exactly how the Preston family stole your life's work. Dad, I don't know if I can do that. These people, they'll all believe the Preston family's version of events. They'll think I'm just a failed entrepreneur making excuses. Son, by the time we're done, everyone in that room will know exactly who the real failures are. Over the next 3 days, my house became a war room. Doug set up his equipment in my garage, working 18-hour days to compile evidence and prepare presentations. Dennis worked with handwriting experts and forensic accountants to document the fraud. Vivian helped coordinate logistics and research the guest list for the networking event. Meanwhile, I made phone calls. My 30 years in aerospace had given me connections throughout the business community, people who valued integrity and had little patience for fraud. I reached out to a few carefully selected contacts, asking subtle questions about the Preston family's reputation and business practices. What I learned was illuminating. Several people mentioned concerns about Harriet Preston's aggressive acquisition tactics. A few had heard rumors about questionable business practices. One contact, a retired bank president, told me confidentially that Preston Investments had been flagged for unusual financial activity by federal regulators. Frank, I can't give you details, but I can tell you that family is not as solid as they appear. Their debt-to-asset ratio is concerning, and their cash flow depends heavily on continued acquisitions. If something disrupted their business model, they'd be in serious trouble? Let's just say they've built their empire on leverage and reputation. Damage either one, and the whole structure becomes unstable. That conversation gave me the final piece of my strategy. The Preston family wasn't just vulnerable to legal action, they were financially vulnerable. Their entire operation depended on maintaining their reputation for success and their access to credit and investment capital. If we could damage that reputation publicly, we wouldn't just recover Ethan's company. We'd collapse their entire criminal enterprise. On Thursday evening, 2 days before the networking event, I called a family meeting. Ethan, Vivian, Doug, and Dennis gathered in my living room while I outlined the final plan. Tomorrow night, the Preston family will be celebrating their latest conquest in front of 200 potential investors, business leaders, and media representatives. They'll be presenting LogiFlow as their success story and themselves as innovative entrepreneurs. I pulled up the event program on my laptop. Harriet Preston is scheduled to speak at 8:30. Her presentation is titled, Building Technology Companies Through Strategic Family Investment. The irony is incredible, Vivian muttered. It gets better. According to the program, they're announcing a major new investment round. They're asking for $5 million in additional capital to expand LogiFlow's operations. Doug looked up from his laptop. Mr. Carter, I've been monitoring their financial filings. They need that investment. Without it, they can't service their existing debt. The whole operation could collapse. Which means tomorrow night isn't just a presentation. It's a crucial fundraising event. They can't afford for it to go wrong. I stood and walked to the whiteboard where we'd mapped out our strategy. Here's what's going to happen. At 8:15, just before Harriet's presentation, I'm going to request permission to address the attendees as a founding investor. I'll have 15 minutes to present our evidence before they can react. What if they refuse to let you speak? Dennis asked. Then we move to Plan B. Doug will be in the hotel's technical booth, ready to override their presentation system with our evidence. Vivian will be positioned near the media representatives, ready to distribute documentation. Ethan will be at the back of the room with copies of all our legal filings, ready to serve papers if necessary. Ethan looked nervous. Dad, what if this doesn't work? What if they convince everyone that we're lying? Son, we're not lying. We have documentation, witnesses, and technical evidence. We have 30 years of my reputation in this community, and we have something the Preston family doesn't have. What's that? The truth. And in my experience, the truth has a way of winning when it's presented clearly and backed by solid evidence. I looked around the room at the team we'd assembled. Tomorrow night, we're going to walk into that ballroom and destroy the Preston family's reputation in front of everyone who matters in their business world. We're going to expose them as thieves and frauds, and we're going to do it using their own event, their own guest list, and their own moment of triumph. And then? Vivian asked. Then we take everything back. The company, the house, the money, and most importantly, my son's reputation and his children's future. I turned to Ethan. Are you ready for this? For the first time since I'd found him sleeping in that parking lot, my son's expression showed something other than defeat. There was anger there, and determination, and maybe even a little of the confidence that had made LogiFlow successful in the first place. Dad, let's destroy them. The grand ballroom of the Meridian Hotel buzzed with the energy of 200 business leaders, investors, and entrepreneurs. I stood near the registration table, watching as the Preston family worked the room with practiced efficiency. Harriet Preston, elegant in a navy suit, moved from group to group with the confidence of someone who owned the space. Peter Preston stood near the bar, discussing financial projections with potential investors. Lauren, radiant in a red dress, charmed a group of local media representatives. They looked like success. They looked like winners. They had no idea what was coming. Mr. Carter? A young woman with a clipboard approached me. I'm Sarah from the Event Planning Committee. Ms. Preston asked me to seat you at table 12, near the back. I smiled politely. Actually, I believe there's been a mistake. As a founding investor in LogiFlow, I should be seated at the sponsors table. The woman checked her list, looking confused. I'm sorry, but I don't see you listed as a sponsor. Perhaps you should check with the original event planning documents. I believe you'll find my name there. While she went to verify my status, I scanned the room for my team. Doug was near the technical booth, posing as hotel audio-visual support. Vivian had positioned herself among the media representatives, her architect's portfolio making her look like another potential investor. Dennis White stood near the legal representatives section, ready to serve papers the moment we proved fraud. Ethan was the wild card. He'd insisted on attending, despite my concerns about his emotional state. I'd finally agreed, but only if he stayed in the back and remained invisible until the crucial moment. Mr. Carter? The event coordinator returned, looking flustered. I apologize for the confusion. You're absolutely right. You are listed as a founding sponsor. Let me escort you to table 1. As we walked toward the front of the room, I felt eyes following us. Harriet Preston's expression shifted from confident hostess to wary predator, as she realized I was not only present, but being seated in a position of prominence. Franklin! Peter Preston appeared at my elbow with forced joviality. What a pleasant surprise. We weren't sure you'd be able to make it. Wouldn't miss it for the world, Peter. I'm very interested to hear about LogiFlow's recent success. Yes. Well, Harriet has built something really special. The company has exceeded all our projections. I'm sure it has. I'm particularly curious about the technical innovations. Ethan always said the core algorithms were groundbreaking. Peter's smile faltered slightly. Actually, most of the current technology was developed under Harriet's leadership. The original systems needed significant upgrades. Fascinating. I'd love to see the technical documentation showing those improvements. Before Peter could respond, the lights dimmed and the evening's program began. I took my seat at table 1, directly in front of the stage, and waited. The first hour proceeded exactly as planned. Local business leaders gave brief remarks about the importance of innovation and entrepreneurship. A representative from the mayor's office praised the Preston family's contribution to the local economy. A technology journalist discussed trends in logistics software. All the while, I sat quietly, occasionally nodding and applauding at appropriate moments. To any observer, I was simply another investor enjoying a successful business event. At 8:15, the Master of Ceremonies introduced Harriet Preston as the evening's keynote speaker. She walked to the podium with theatrical confidence, her presentation slides already loaded and ready. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight to celebrate not just the success of LogiFlow Solutions, but the power of strategic family investment in American innovation. She clicked to her first slide, which showed LogiFlow's logo and the tagline, "Built by the Preston family." The irony was breathtaking. 2 years ago, my family identified a gap in the logistics software market. We saw an opportunity to create something revolutionary, a system that could transform how companies manage their supply chains. I let her continue for 5 minutes, allowing her to dig herself deeper into the lie. She showed slides detailing her technical innovations, her business development strategies, and her vision for the company's future. Every word was a theft of my son's work. Finally, when she paused for questions, I stood. "Ms. Preston, I have a question about the company's founding history." Harriet's eyes found me in the crowd, and I saw a flash of panic before she recovered her composure. "Of course, Mr. Carter. What would you like to know?" "I'm curious about the timeline you've presented. You mentioned that your family founded LogiFlow 2 years ago, but I have documentation showing that the company was actually founded 18 months ago by my son, Ethan Carter. Could you clarify this discrepancy?" The room fell silent. I could feel 200 pairs of eyes shifting between Harriet and me, sensing tension but not yet understanding its source. "Mr. Carter, I think there may be some confusion about the corporate history. While your son was involved in the early development, the foundational work and business strategy were developed by my team." "I see. And could you explain how you developed the core algorithms that make LogiFlow's software so innovative?" Harriet hesitated. "The technical development was a collaborative effort involving our entire team." I pulled out my phone and gestured toward the technical booth. "Doug, could you please display slide package A on the main screen?" The hotel's projection system flickered, and suddenly the screen behind Harriet showed a side-by-side comparison of code. On the left was LogiFlow's current software. On the right was Ethan's original prototype, dated 8 months before Harriet claimed to have founded the company. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent ballroom, "what you're seeing is evidence that LogiFlow's core technology was stolen. The code on the right was written by my son, Ethan Carter, in his apartment, months before the Preston family claims to have invented it." The room erupted in murmurs. Harriet stepped back from the podium, her face pale. "Doug, could you show slide package B?" The screen changed to display business plan documents, again side by side. Ethan's original plan on the right, the Preston family's founding document on the left, with identical language and concepts but different names and dates. "This is intellectual property theft on a massive scale," I continued, my voice cutting through the growing commotion. "The Preston family has stolen not just a company, but an entire innovation and claimed it as their own." "This is outrageous," Harriet found her voice. "Security. I want this man removed immediately." But I wasn't finished. "Doug, slide package C, please." The screen now showed financial documents, bank records, investment agreements, and corporate filings that traced my $300,000 investment and its subsequent disappearance into Preston-controlled accounts. The Preston family didn't just steal intellectual property. They committed investment fraud, forged legal documents, and used family relationships to systematically loot a successful startup company. I turned to address the room directly. "How many of you have been approached by Preston Investments about business opportunities? How many have been told about their track record of successful acquisitions?" Several hands went up tentatively. You should know that their track record consists of identifying vulnerable companies, infiltrating them through family relationships, and stealing them through legal manipulation. LogiFlow is the 5th company they've done this to. Dennis White stood from his table near the back. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Dennis White, attorney for Mr. Carter and Ethan Carter. What you've seen tonight is evidence that will be presented in federal court next week. We have documentation of securities fraud, wire fraud, intellectual property theft, and racketeering." The room was in chaos now. Investors were pulling out phones, making calls. Media representatives were taking notes frantically. Several people had stood and were moving toward the exits. But I still wasn't finished. "Harriet Preston, you asked for clarification about the company's founding. Let me provide it." I gestured toward the back of the room. "Ethan, would you please join us?" My son emerged from the crowd, walking steadily toward the stage. He looked nervous but determined, carrying a folder of documents. "This is Ethan Carter," I announced, "the actual founder of LogiFlow Solutions, the man whose work you've been claiming as your own, the father whose children you threw out of their home when he discovered your theft." Ethan reached the stage and took the microphone. For a moment, he just stood there, looking out at the crowd of business leaders who had written him off as a failure. 18 months ago, he began, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I had an idea for software that could revolutionize logistics management. I worked 16-hour days in my apartment, writing code and building prototypes. I found investors, including my father, who believed in the vision." He opened his folder and pulled out a photograph. "This is a picture of me in LogiFlow's original office, the day we signed our first major client. I was proud of what we'd built. I was excited about the future." He pulled out another document. "This is a termination notice served to me by the Preston family's lawyers 3 weeks ago. It informed me that I was no longer employed by the company I founded, that I had no ownership stake in the business I built, and that I was prohibited from entering the office where I'd spent the last year of my life. The room was completely silent now, everyone focused on Ethan's words. The Preston family didn't just steal my company. They stole my identity as an entrepreneur, they stole my children's home, they stole my father's investment, and they did it all while claiming to be helping me. He looked directly at Harriet Preston, who stood frozen behind the podium. But they made one crucial mistake. They assumed that because they had lawyers and money and social connections, they could rewrite history. They forgot that the truth has a way of surviving, especially when people are willing to fight for it. Ethan turned back to the crowd. Tonight, with my father's help, I'm taking back what was stolen. LogiFlow Solutions is my company. The technology you've heard about tonight is my innovation. And anyone who invests in the Preston family's version of my company is investing in a lie. I stepped forward and took the microphone back. Ladies and gentlemen, what you've witnessed tonight is the exposure of a criminal enterprise. The Preston family has built their wealth by destroying other families and stealing their life's work. I pulled out a legal document and held it up. This is a court order, filed this afternoon, freezing all assets of LogiFlow Solutions pending investigation of fraud claims. This is a criminal complaint filed with federal prosecutors alleging racketeering and organized theft. And this is a civil lawsuit seeking damages for the theft of intellectual property and fraudulent conversion of investment funds. The ballroom had erupted into complete chaos. Harriet Preston stood behind the podium looking stunned, her carefully planned presentation forgotten. Peter Preston was near the bar, arguing frantically with someone on his phone. Lauren had disappeared entirely, but I had one more card to play. "There's something else you should know," I announced, my voice cutting